Before the Carpathia had even reached New York, carrying not only her own passengers and crew, but every last survivor of the Titanic disaster, the wheels had already been set in motion for an official inquiry in the U.S. Senate to investigate the cause of the ship's sinking. These hearings, to be conducted by the Senator William Alden Smith of Michigan, beginning at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York City, were intended to find not only who was to blame for the catastrophe, but also intended to recommend changes to maritime law and regulations for the future. Of those questioned were some of Titanic's most notable passengers and crew members, as well as passengers still reeling from the ordeal they had just overcome. The world itself had fundamentally changed overnight. Picking up the pieces and solving the puzzle would be no easy task. The open and public nature of the hearings also meant that a media frenzy would ensue among journalists in attendance who were all hungry to keep chasing the Titanic story and happy to add fuel to the fire to sell papers. The world watched transfixed as the story of Titanic began to reveal itself little by little over the course of the 18-day inquiry, and all the while questions began to rise about the man at the center of it all, painting a very shaky picture of the American judicial system and their treatment of the delicate situation. Once all was said and done, the resulting testimony given added up to 1,100 pages of text, some of it contradictory, most of it confusing, and often marred by the witnesses struggling to recall accurate details while still processing immense grief and trauma. But for the first time, the story of Titanic had officially been told. And what a story it was. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs, and this is the incredible true story of the first Titanic inquiry. In the days immediately following the Titanic disaster, U.S. Senator Alden Smith sat in his office poring over newspaper headlines, all bearing the same grim news. The brand new White Star liner Titanic had sunk with a great loss of life. For Smith, this news came as not only troubling, but puzzling. While having very little in the way of maritime knowledge himself, Smith had very fond memories of travelling with his son on board the RMS Baltic just 6 years ago, commanded by none other than the venerable Captain E.J. Smith, who had himself taken command of Titanic just days before, and now, it seemed, had perished with his ship. The senator had taken a liking to the wizened old captain during this voyage, having joined him for dinner and a tour of the Baltic. He counted himself quite impressed by both the ship and her captain, who had seemed to be the picture of the reliable old shipmaster who could weather any storm. So now, as the senator gazed down at the headlines spread out before him, the question on his mind was the same as the question on everybody else's minds: what had happened? This wreck cannot have been a consequence of a foolhardy and reckless captain, because the E.J. Smith he had come to know couldn't have been further from that. Senator Smith knew that an intensive investigation would need to take place in order to find the answers, but upon phoning President Taft, he learned that the president intended to do essentially nothing in response to the disaster. He was too riddled with grief over the loss of his close friend and aide, Major Archibald Butt, who had been tragically lost in the sinking. Frustrated and full of unanswered questions, Smith decided to take action. If anyone was going to reveal the truth behind the Titanic disaster, it would have to be Senator Alden Smith himself. With the Carpathia fast approaching the New York docks, Smith knew that if any meaningful action was to be taken, there could be absolutely no delays. Just 2 days after the sinking of Titanic, with the Carpathia still steaming her way, carrying all of those survivors from the disaster towards New York, Smith introduced a resolution to the U.S. Senate, laying out his intent to form a subcommittee to investigate the sinking and use the findings of the investigation to recommend changes to maritime safety. This was a forward-thinking move from Smith, who despised panic legislation and was taking pains to stop such measures before they could begin. He was of the mind that preventing another disaster like that of Titanic could only be possible once all the full story was known, and laws could then be passed to address the issues that came to light from the investigation. This was no time for assumptions or guesswork, and clearly many agreed. The resolution was passed, and Senator Smith got to work immediately ironing out the legalities of subpoenaing British citizens for an American investigation. Under advisement from the president, it was decided that Smith was well within his rights to subpoena Titanic's surviving crew and passengers, because the White Star Line was owned by an American parent company, the International Mercantile Marine. Because of this, Titanic was legally an American-owned vessel. When asked by a reporter how Congress could have any jurisdiction over British citizens, Smith replied, "We may not have jurisdiction over the individual, but the American Congress is not without jurisdiction over the harbours of the United States." It is for these men who make use of these harbours to meet the public demand for information in regard to the disaster. After speaking to reporters, Smith made his way to New York Harbor by train, where he planned to meet none other than J. Bruce Ismay, Titanic survivor and the chairman of the White Star Line, on board Carpathia as soon as she docked. It was not for lack of empathy that Smith didn't even allow Ismay time to step foot on dry land before being issued the subpoena. Smith's office had intercepted several curious telegrams sent under the clever codename Yampsy, or Ismay spelt backwards, requesting that the White Star office hold the RMS Cedric so that Ismay and the remaining Titanic crew members could return home aboard her to England as soon as possible. For the sake of Smith's investigation, this wouldn't do. He couldn't very well have his most important witnesses being whisked off across the Atlantic before the investigation had even begun. Upon boarding Carpathia in New York, Smith found his way to the cabin of the ship's surgeon, where Ismay had been staying, and ignoring a handwritten sign on the door which read, "Please do not knock," Smith burst in. Philip Franklin, vice president of the International Mercantile Marine, answered the door and informed Smith that Ismay was far too ill to accept visitors. But unwilling to take no for an answer, Smith simply said, "I'm sorry, I shall have to see that for myself." A half hour later, Smith re-emerged from the cabin, having gotten what he came for, and upon leaving Carpathia, he was met by a crowd of reporters who had got wind of this intense conversation with Ismay. Smith informed them that Ismay, the White Star chairman, would be appearing the very next day at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel for questioning alongside Titanic's 4 surviving officers. The investigation was officially about to begin. But despite seeming businesslike and collected on the surface, though, as Smith left Pier 54, the senator was beginning to realise the immense gravity of the disaster he was grappling with. He had witnessed panicked families begging him for more information on the whereabouts of their loved ones. He'd heard the hysterical wailing of grief, blended with the joyful laughter of those being reunited. It was a jarring experience that he had found to be deeply disturbing. It was enough to put him on pins and needles. The weeks ahead were about to be long and painful, but the truth of the Titanic needed to be discovered once and for all. The very next morning, on April 19th, a massive crowd had assembled itself out the front of the Waldorf Astoria Hotel. The doors opened promptly at 9 a.m, and within 3 minutes the east room of the hotel was filled to the brim with reporters, photographers, and anxious spectators, all packed shoulder to shoulder, all desperate to know the truth behind the historic disaster. An hour later, Senator Alden Smith arrived, accompanied by Senator Francis Newlands of Nevada and Steamship Inspector General Euler. Now, the first witness called to give testimony was, of course, J. Bruce Ismay, a man whose character was already being called into question by the very fact that he had survived the sinking at all. Ismay was seated at the large conference table situated in the centre of the hall, flanked on either side by White Star Vice President Philip Franklin and Titanic's highest-ranking surviving officer, Charles Lightoller. Senator Smith began by asking Ismay a few preliminary questions, and immediately the frantic flashing of cameras and the popping of bulbs filled the room. But the media free-for-all was over as quickly as it began, with Senator Smith shouting, "Get those photographers out of here!" And with this interruption aside, formal questioning could finally commence. Ismay took the stand and faced his first round of intensive questioning. 2 more would follow in the coming weeks, and for Senator Smith it was vital that his line of questions leave no stone unturned. Ismay was, after all, the most obvious and convenient villain for this disaster, being the wealthy English gentleman who'd fled the sinking ship, while so many women and children perished behind him. But even worse, rumours were quickly spreading that Ismay had directly ordered Captain Smith to attempt a record crossing, ultimately speeding the vessel into an ice field that had sunk it. This could be an easy win for Smith and a death knell for Ismay's reputation, but Ismay, it seems, had heard the rumours and was ready to address them head-on. When asked about his role in loading the lifeboats, Ismay was quick to put the allegations to rest. He said, "I assisted as best I could getting the boats out and putting the women and children in. I stood upon the deck practically until I left the ship in the starboard collapsible lifeboat, which is the last boat to leave the ship so far as I know. More than that, I do not know." Later in Ismay's testimony, he described exactly how he found himself in a lifeboat, despite the order being given for women and children first. Smith asked him, "What were the circumstances of your departure from the ship?" "I ask merely that," but Ismay cut him off. He said, "The boat was there. There was a certain number of men in the boat, and the officer called out asking if there were any more women, and there was no response. There were no passengers left on the deck." Smith asked, "There were no passengers on the deck?" Ismay said, "No, sir, and as the boat was in the act of being lowered away, I got into it." Now, this bit of testimony would prove to be very important in Ismay's case, as rumours of his misconduct throughout the evening had spread since the news broke of the sinking, including accusations of cowardice, Ismay jumping into the very first lifeboat to be lowered, and even wilder accusations of Ismay disguising himself as a woman to gain entry into a lifeboat. Another common misconception that prevails to this day suggests that Ismay had put pressure on Captain Smith to increase the ship's speed in order to reach New York a day earlier, a decision which would have had dire consequences as the ship sped her way through the ice field. But Ismay's testimony paints a different picture of those events. Smith asked him, "Did you have occasion to consult with the captain about the movement of the ship?" Ismay said, "Never." Smith asked, "Did he consult you about it?" And Ismay said, "Never. Perhaps I am wrong in saying that. I should like to say this. I do not know that it was quite a matter of consulting him about it, of his consulting me about it. But what we had arranged to do was that we would not attempt to arrive in New York at the lightship before 5 o'clock on Wednesday morning." Smith asked, "Was it supposed that you could reach New York at the time without putting the ship to its full running capacity?" Ismay said, "Oh yes, sir, there was nothing to be gained by arriving at New York any earlier than that." Now, Ismay may have been bending the truth a little bit here. He and Captain Smith had, at one point, discussed the ship's speed. They were overheard by a passenger in the vessel's reception room, and Ismay was noted to observe that they were on track to beat Olympic's crossing time on her maiden voyage. Now, while some may point to this as a gentle nudge to the ship's captain to possibly push the engines a bit harder, the decision to do so always rested with Captain Smith and Captain Smith alone. Even still, with such prominent passengers on board, such as Ismay, the ship's owner, as well as her designer, Thomas Andrews, Smith very well may have felt an unspoken pressure to pull off a notable crossing for Titanic's maiden voyage and his final outing before retirement. The bosses were, after all, watching. Now, throughout the proceedings, Ismay asserted that he was more than willing to cooperate with what was happening to whatever extent was necessary. But after defending himself at length for hours, upon leaving the conference room, he was quick to bring the legality of the hearings into question before the press, a move that at this early stage only really served to make the scapegoat of Titanic look even more undignified. Having already once attempted to secure passage home on the Seadric for himself and Titanic's surviving crew members before the inquiries had even begun, Ismay was once again frustrated at his inability to leave American soil and felt it unlawful that British citizens should be detained. While his complaints wouldn't seem so incendiary as the hearings continued, his decision to speak out against the hearings to the press seemed to many to be a tactless move, especially for a man actively working to clear his own name. Unfortunately for Ismay, the reputational damage would haunt him for the rest of his life. Despite multiple attempts to clear his name, and many of the allegations against him having been proven false, he would never outlive the public smear campaign that resulted following the sinking. The public needed to believe somebody was to blame for Titanic, and the picture the press painted of Bruce Ismay was unfortunately a very easy sell. The same day, Titanic's second officer, Charles Lightoller, was called to testify. He started out by describing his role in the ship's trials and testing, with Smith grilling him to describe each process in detail. Now, Lightoller was a notorious company man with a penchant for playing his cards very close to his chest, and his evasive responses quickly became an annoyance for Senator Smith, who continually needed to press Lightoller to be more specific. Once the senator was satisfied with Lightoller's accounts of the ship's testing, the majority of the remaining testimony on that first day was focused on recounting Lightoller's actions during the sinking, most notably the loading and lowering of the ship's port-side lifeboats. Now, many of the boats on that side of the ship had been lowered away before being filled to their complete 65-person capacity, and Lightoller's decision to not fill these boats completely had come under heavy scrutiny in the days immediately following the sinking. Senator Smith took the opportunity to press the officer for more answers. Now, initially, Lightoller claimed he simply didn't realise the extent of the emergency, and said he was more concerned about the 70-foot drop from the deck to the sea than about filling the boats completely. But once it became clear that the ship and her passengers were in mortal danger, Lightoller admits that he took more risks loading the boats with some 35 passengers, still well below capacity, but he claimed the boats didn't seem safe when filled beyond that point. With the first day of testimony complete, the subcommittee retired to review their findings so far. Many felt that Lightoller had not presented all of the facts, and the White Star was attempting to supply only the bare minimum evidence in order to speed through the hearings and see their employees brought back home to England. Now, beyond this was the issue of Bruce Ismay's appeal to be excused from the remainder of the hearings and be sent home to be with his family, a request which Senator Smith continued to deny. Rumours continued to circulate about the possibility of negligence aboard Titanic prior to her sinking, and while the blame for this negligence may not have lain with Ismay alone, he would be called for further testimony to address the concerns publicly. Ismay, along with the ship's surviving officers and crew, were to remain in the United States for the remainder of the hearings. The next morning's hearings were held in the much larger Myrtle Room, given issues with the crowding and harsh echoes experienced in the Waldorf Astoria's smaller East Room. Now, this second day saw testimony given by Harold Cottam, Carpathia's wireless operator, and Harold Bride from Titanic. Cottam's testimony transfixed the crowd. The 21-year-old appeared not much more than a boy, described his harrowing experiences manning Carpathia's wireless room from Sunday night right up until Wednesday afternoon without stepping away or sleeping, save for a few hours in which he admits to inadvertently drifting off in front of his instrument. He was then relieved by Harold Bride, who, despite his own extensive injuries from frostbite preventing him from even walking, had taken over Cottam's duties to allow him to rest. Cottam described in detail the messages he sent and received on the night of April 14th in regards to the imperiled Titanic, leading up to the moment that the ship finally went dark. It was at this moment that Senator Smith called Harold Bride to testify, and a somber atmosphere settled over the room. The severely injured young man was wheeled into the room, bandaged and clearly exhausted, his expression showing all of the weight of the tragedy he was now bearing. There was little room to maneuver a wheelchair through the crowded room though, so Bride needed to be carried to his place at the conference table and seated in a large chair near the senators, who now needed him to relive in detail the night he nearly lost his life. He gave his age, just 22 years old. After reviewing the finer points of his experience and duties as wireless operator, Bride was questioned on the messages he sent and received the night of the sinking. It was here that an interesting, uncomfortable point arose. In desperation, and trying to keep the lines of communication open with rescue ships, Bride's colleague Jack Phillips had been frustrated by the German liner Frankfurt for cutting in and asking, "What is the matter with you?" Bride recalled that Phillips called the German a fool in response and essentially told him to shut up. The Germans did not take kindly to this perceived slight and pointed to this interaction as British inefficiency at sea, claiming that it's likely the Titanic disaster may have claimed far fewer lives had the Frankfurt not been sidelined. Now this is, of course, completely untrue. The Frankfurt was too far away to help, but Bride defended his colleague's actions on the stands and essentially pointed out that this was a matter of course. He and fellow wireless officer Phillips knew for certain the Carpathia was on her way, and Frankfurt's attempts would be simply too little, too late. While finishing up the second day's proceedings, Senator Smith concluded with an announcement that a number of Titanic's surviving officers and crew, including managing directors Bruce Ismay and Philip Franklin, were to be subpoenaed and to appear in Washington, D.C. on Monday for the next round of hearings. Those not subpoenaed were free to return home at last, and some 172 British survivors of the disaster were finally free to return to England on board the SS Lapland on Saturday, the very next day. This was despite Ismay's repeated requests that he and the surviving officers be allowed to return home to England as soon as possible. With this new round of subpoenas, Smith was making it clear he was in it for the long haul. Ismay's hands, for now, were tied. The venue was changed from the Waldorf Astoria in New York City to the caucus room of the Russell Senate Office Building in Washington, D.C. on Monday, April 22nd. The room was as fresh and new as Titanic had been on boarding day. Dubbed the throne room by the first few people to step inside, this massive and ornately decorated room had never been used before until this very morning. The spotless room was immediately flooded by a throng of enthusiastic and curious ladies carrying sack lunches and crowding shoulder to shoulder, eager to witness the day's events. Now this did not sit well with Senator Smith, who had to shove his own way through the crowd of photographers and spectators just to get to his seat. After rejecting a number of those overcrowding the room, Smith began the day's proceedings with this announcement. "We are not at all concerned about the convenience of visitors upon the hearing. We are concerned primarily in obtaining the truth, and I desire each person here to understand that they are here solely by the courtesy of the committee, that the inquiry is not for their entertainment, and that any expression of any kind or character will not be permitted." With that line drawn in the sand, the first to take the stand for this next round of questioning was Philip A.S. Franklin, the Vice President of the International Mercantile Marine Company. Now, in particular, the subcommittee was hoping to dispel confusion surrounding a mysterious Marconigram that had been sent shortly after Titanic's demise, indicating the ship had survived her encounter with the iceberg and was slowly making her way for Halifax with all passengers on board safe and accounted for. It read, "Titanic proceeding to Halifax. Passengers will probably land there Wednesday. All safe. White Star Line." With no witnesses up until this point having taken responsibility for the message, it was now Franklin's turn to explain this egregious oversight. Smith said, "I ask you whether you know anything about the sending of that message or by whom it was authorised or from whom it emanated." Franklin said, "I do not, sir, and since this was mentioned at the meeting in New York on Saturday, we have had our entire passenger staff in number 9 Broadway office asked, and we cannot find out who sent the message." Throughout Franklin's testimony, it becomes more clear that he and the rest of the White Star officers were operating under the assumption that Titanic had survived and was making for Halifax based on rumours circulating in the press and their own confidence in the supposed unsinkable ship. Now, it wasn't until 6:30 p.m. Monday evening, a full 14 hours after Titanic had sunk, that the reality had become painfully clear. This following telegram was received by the White Star officers from the Olympics captain, Titanic's sister ship, captained by Herbert Haddock. He'd said, "Carpathia reached Titanic's position at daybreak, found boats and wreckage only." Franklin goes on to describe the chaos that ensued immediately upon receiving the message. He said, "Immediately that telegram was received by me, it was such a terrible shock that it took us a few minutes to get ourselves together again. Then at once I telephoned, myself, to 2 of our directors, Mr. Steele and Mr. Morgan Jr., and at the same time sent downstairs for the reporters. I started to read the message, holding it in my hands to the reporters. I got off the first line and a half where it said the Titanic sank 2:00 a.m, and there was not a reporter left in the room. They were so anxious to get out to telephone the news. I want to say this, that during the entire day we considered the ship unsinkable, and it never entered our minds that there had been anything like a serious loss of life. We, of course, thought there might have been something in transferring passengers or handling the passengers, but it never entered our minds that there had been a serious loss of life until we got this Haddock message at 6:30. Called next to testify after Franklin was Titanic's 4th officer, Joseph Boxall. The soft-spoken young man clearly struggled with nerves and kept his hands clutched throughout the testimony to keep them from shaking. Despite his timid nature, Boxall's testimony was to be a bombshell. On the night of the sinking, as it became more clear that Titanic and her passengers were in serious danger, Boxall was charged with sending up distress rockets and attempting to signal what appeared to be a nearby vessel. Smith asked, "You say you fired these rockets and otherwise attempted to signal her?" "Yes, sir," Boxall said. "She got close enough, as I thought, to read our electric Morse signal, and I signalled to her. I told her to come at once. We were sinking." Smith, "And did you get any reply?" Boxall, "I cannot say I saw any reply. Some people say she replied to our rockets and our signals, but I did not see them." Smith went on, "From what you saw of that vessel, how far would you think she was from the Titanic?" Boxall, "I should say approximately the ship would be about 5 miles. Now, up until this point, very little had been said of this nearby mystery ship, and now, according to Boxall, a potential rescue had been in view of the Titanic the entire night. Ismay's initial Day 1 testimony had mentioned a nearby vessel as well, though the comment was rather quickly hand-waved away by the committee. Smith asked, "What course was taken by the lifeboat in which you were in after leaving the ship?" Ismay said, "We saw a light some distance off to which we attempted to pull and which we thought was a ship." The committee was now presented with an all-new piece of the puzzle, and when solved, this part would portray the story of the infamous SS Californian, the ship nearby enough, supposedly, to have been able to come to Titanic's aid, yet they claim to have never received any of her distress calls due to their wireless operator being off duty for the evening. The captain of the Californian, Stanley Lord, would later testify to this, but asserted that while he and his crew saw a nearby vessel, it did not seem to be in distress, and they concluded nothing was out of the ordinary. This would ultimately become an indictment on both Lord's command and the established protocols for wireless communication between ships of the day. Today we understand that because Californian was stopped for the night, she could not have rushed to Titanic's aid, but for the time, this was tantalizing news. It ruined Stanley Lord's reputation and that of his ship. Day 4 of the inquiry saw 3rd Officer Herbert Pittman take the stand, and at this point it seemed that the committee was ready to strike right at the heart of the matter. This time, Senator George Perkins took over the questioning. He asked, "And you had boats to accommodate only about 1,200 at most?" Pittman said, "I could not say how many they were supposed to accommodate," but Perkins pressed him. 20 lifeboats with a capacity of about 60, a seaboat and a collapsible, let us call the average 60, it would be about 1,200 passengers and crew they were capable of carrying. Pittman said, "Yes." Perkins, "Therefore, she had life-saving appliances for only about 1/2 of the passengers and crew?" Impatient and testily, Pittman replied, "All these details can be got from the builders, I suppose." Now, Pittman's testimony began to shed more light on the protocols for training and testing of the lifeboats on Titanic as part of the British Board of Trade. Smith asked, But what I would like to know is just what it was necessary to do in order to satisfy the Board of Trade. Pittman: well, put a crew of men in the boat, lower her into the water, and pull her around the harbour and sail her back to the satisfaction of the Board of Trade officials. Smith: and 2 of them were lowered? Pittman: 2 of them were lowered. Incredulous, Smith asked, as a matter of fact, no further drill was had on the Titanic after leaving Southampton, was there? Pittman simply said, no, sir. A few more important pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place. It seemed as though over the course of the Titanic's short life, testing of safety equipment and the drills required of the crew had been something of an afterthought. Several of Titanic's officers had now separately testified that no drills had been performed since leaving Southampton, and in that drill that did occur at Southampton, only 2 lifeboats were actually tested. The officers and crew all seemed conflicted on the number of passengers that could be safely loaded into a boat at all, and the women and children first rule was heeded differently on each side of the ship. The lack of training and the coordination caused significant confusion in an already dire emergency, and very likely resulted in further loss of life. Now, this was not a show of negligence on the part of Titanic's crew, though. Everything from the number of lifeboats available to the necessary testing and boat drills was dictated by the British Board of Trade, whose standards by this time were hopelessly outdated with massive steamships like Titanic. The most unfortunate part of all was that it took a tragedy the magnitude of Titanic to force a much-needed overhaul to these requirements. The inquiries would also suffer from no shortage of interpersonal drama. Senator Smith had successfully subpoenaed citizens of a foreign country to remain in the US to give their testimonies regarding the disaster, but for many of them, patience was beginning to wear thin. 172 of Titanic's surviving crew had successfully returned home on April 20th, but a select few, namely the highest-ranking officers and White Star's management, had been prevented from returning home thanks to this new subpoena by Senator Smith. The British government was not taking kindly to the senator's insistence upon detaining its citizens on foreign soil, and Bruce Ismay was very vocal in his displeasure that his repeated requests to return home were being denied. In a letter to Senator Smith, dated Thursday, April 25th, Ismay wrote that, if the committee wishes to examine me further at the present time, I hope it may be found convenient to do so promptly, in order that I may go home to my family in view of my experience at the time of the disaster, and subsequently, I hope that the committee will feel that this request is not unreasonable. In a reply dated the same day, Senator Smith wrote, as I said to you in New York on Friday evening last, when you asked to be permitted to return home, and again on Saturday night when you made the same request, I shall not consent to your leaving this country until the fullest inquiry has been made into the circumstances surrounding the accident. This information can be fully detailed by yourself and other officers of your company and the officers and crew of your ship. I am working night and day to achieve this result, and you should continue to help me instead of annoying me and delaying my work by your personal importunities. Trusting you will receive this letter in the spirit in which it is written, I am very respectfully, W.M. Alden Smith. In the eyes of the survivors, their families, the press, and foreign governments, Smith was beginning to rapidly lose credibility. His lack of understanding of the subject matter at hand also showed through in his lines of questioning, such as his apparent morbid curiosity as Second Officer Lightoller described the collapse of the forward funnel. Smith asked, "What was this that fell?" Lightoller said, "The forward funnel." Smith, "Did it strike the boat?" Lightoller, "It missed the boat." "Then what?" "Well, it fell on all the people that were alongside of the boat, if there were any there." "Injure any of them seriously?" Smith asked. Lightoller said, "I could not say, sir." Smith, "Did it kill anybody?" Lightoller, "I could not say, sir." Later on in the same testimony, though, Smith seemed to have a strange interpretation of how Titanic's watertight compartments were meant to be utilised. Of Lightoller, he asked, "Are you able to say whether any of the crew or passengers took to these upper watertight compartments as a final, last resort, as a place to die?" "I'm quite unable to say, sir," said Lightoller. Now, this particular gaffe earned Smith no small amount of ridicule in the press, along with the nickname Watertight Smith, further cementing his public persona as a clueless politician out of his depth when it came to nautical and maritime know-how. On day 5 of the hearings, while questioning the notoriously feisty 5th Officer Lowe, Senator Smith attempted to truly get at the heart of the matter when he asked, "Do you know what an iceberg is composed of?" Lowe, smirking, said, "Ice, I suppose, sir." Meanwhile, the British press was having a field day with Smith's apparent incompetence, not to mention their fellow citizens being held against their will, at the mercy of a man who seemed to be making a fool of himself at every turn. A particular incendiary piece was published in the London Globe, calling Smith a gentleman from the wilds of Michigan who is possibly compelled by the exigencies of electioneering to be as insolent as possible to Englishmen. Now, the British newspaper Daily Sketch published a short editorial column from its New York offices on April 27th, which read, "British criticisms of Senator Smith and his methods of investigation appear to be fully concurred in by the majority of Americans, and it would not be too much to say that the senator is the laughingstock here as he seems to be in England." But the American press was quick to counter this sentiment with their own moral grandstanding. The New York Herald printed that nothing has been more sympathetic, more gentle in its highest sense than the conduct of this inquiry by the Senate committee, and yet self-complacent moguls in England call this impertinent. This country intends to find out why so many American lives were wasted by the incompetency of British seamen, and why women and children were sent to their deaths while so many in a British crew have been saved. The Philadelphia Press published their own op-ed in the situation, maintaining that Senator Smith's inquiries have brought out and placed on permanent record the circumstances and conditions under which the great catastrophe took place. If, incidentally, the examinations disclose that the chairman of the committee is not an expert in nautical matters and asked some questions that caused the seamen to smile, what does it matter? The value of this investigation is not in the questions, but in the answers. The hearings officially concluded on May 28th, when Senator Smith presented his final report to the committee. Now, these findings took particular aim at the British Board of Trade, as well as the general standards of seafaring on the day, recognising that the testing and training protocol of the ship's safety equipment was hopelessly inadequate. The crew were unprepared to deal with an actual disaster at sea, he found, a detail which ultimately resulted in needless loss of life. Passengers had been given no indication that there was an emergency, were unsure whether to proceed to the lifeboats or stay on the ship until it was too late for many. Orders from the crew and officers were conflicting, when they were given at all, and it took far too long for the evacuation to get underway in earnest. It was also found that Titanic's Captain Smith had not done enough to heed the ice warnings received from nearby ships, which could have had as much to do with his confidence in his vessel as it did with his confidence in his own seafaring, but now this confidence seemed misplaced. It was also thought that the Californian had played its own role in the catastrophe, having failed to come to Titanic's aid despite being within sight of the ship as it went down. The lack of around-the-clock wireless contributed heavily to this critical misstep, as did Captain Lord's rather lackadaisical attitude towards sighting the distress rockets in the distance. Possibly most damning of all, the horrendously outdated British Board of Trade lifeboat requirements meant that while Titanic met and even technically exceeded these standards, she lacked proper lifeboat space for about half of the ship's complement of passengers. Now, these regulations had been set for any ship greater than 10,000 tons, and of course, Titanic dwarfed this at over 46,000. It seemed that protocols and regulations had barely even attempted to keep up with the rapid progress made in naval engineering in the latter part of the 19th century, and what may have been possibly adequate for ships half of Titanic's size in decades past was now woefully out of date for these massive steamships carrying thousands of people across the sea. These oversights came at the cost of 1,496 human lives. As a result of the Titanic inquiry, it was recommended that all ships carry enough life-saving apparatus to accommodate all of those on board. New emphasis would also be put on more lifeboat drills and inspections, so as to prevent the confusion experienced on the night of Titanic's sinking. The International Convention for Safety of Life at Sea, or SOLAS, was drafted in response to this disaster, overhauling almost every aspect of maritime safety practices. Now, though it wouldn't officially pass until 1914, and was ultimately brushed to the side with the outbreak of the First World War, in the weeks and months following the Titanic disaster, almost every major transatlantic passenger carrier updated their lifeboat requirements accordingly. The SS Californian's role in the disaster brought about its own changes to maritime law. The botched response to Titanic's distress calls had been at least in part caused by a lack of around-the-clock wireless, since the Californian's only wireless operator had already retired for bed when Titanic's messages of distress came through. The Radio Act of 1912 was passed in direct response to this. The Act, along with the provisions in SOLAS, called for 24/7 wireless operation on all passenger ships, along with backup power for the wireless apparatus in case of emergency. With this, it was hoped that no future distress call would ever again fall on deaf ears. also placed on more comprehensive patrol and reporting of ice, especially on the North Atlantic tracks, which passenger ships routinely followed. In the immediate aftermath of the sinking, the US Navy dispatched ships and large cutters to patrol for ice in the vicinity of Titanic's final position, but it was found that action on a larger scale was necessary to ensure that all checks were in place. Now, up until this point, it had been largely the responsibility of a ship's crew and captain alone to monitor for ice at sea and report their findings to other ships. In response, the International Ice Patrol was founded as an arm of the US Coast Guard with the purpose of reporting dangerous ice conditions in the North Atlantic. This organisation still exists and operates to this day, though they now make use of aircraft rather than ships for increased visibility over larger swathes of sea. The construction and design of ships was also altered in the wake of the sinking. Double bottoms, like the type Titanic had, were now expanded on many ships like her sister Olympic into full double hulls, which now extended all the way up to the waterline to further reinforce the sides of the ships. Bulkheads were also extended to reach all the way to the top decks, making them fully waterproof. In Titanic's case, we know these bulkheads only extended to about 10 feet above the waterline, making it impossible to fully seal them. The results of the Senate inquiries showed that much of what transpired the night of April 15, 1912 was largely preventable and was ultimately the result of lax and outdated safety regulations, improper handling of ice warnings, and simple hubris. The idea that the ship was a lifeboat unto itself was proven to be little more than an Edwardian fairy tale, and it took the world's largest maritime tragedy to that point to see changes made to this backwards mentality. The American inquiry did a pretty decent job of separating a lot of the truth from the myth in the days immediately after the sinking, but it was felt by many, and it was very obvious that the British would need to hold their own inquiry as well. But with over 25,000 questions asked over the course of 42 days of total questioning, more than double the length of the American hearings, this is obviously a topic for another day. Despite a contentious press that looked to lambast Senator Smith's actions through the investigation at almost every possible turn, by the end of the hearings, a column printed by the New York Times conceded that he has brought out what we all wanted to know and had a right to know about the loss of the big ship, and enabled us all to form a clear idea as to where the responsibility, direct or indirect, for that loss lies. The world now knew some of the truth of the Titanic, for better or for worse, and with that, important progress could now be made in hopes that there would never again be a tragedy as painful and avoidable as the loss of the RMS Titanic. Ladies and gentlemen, it's your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a comment below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel because we get new videos out weekly. If you want to support my work and get really cool perks like behind the scenes and early access, please visit my Patreon in the link in the description below, or sign up as a YouTube member. Come and join the crew. As always, stay safe, stay happy, and I'll see you again next time.